Garrett Epps, last July, you wrote in The Atlantic that Brett Kavanaugh is, quote, devoted to the presidency. What did you mean, and what did you see this week?
Well, going back to last July, the moment the nomination was announced, you could see from his resume, we've never had, I'll say never had a judicial candidate, a Supreme Court justice candidate, whose career has been more completely involved with executive power and particularly the White House. Kavanaugh is entirely a product of the District of Columbia, born here in D.C., went to Georgetown Prep, has done virtually his entire legal career here, most of it either in service to the executive branch or as an attorney with Ken Starr involved in kind of investigating and prosecuting a Democratic president. So executive questions are very much on his mind. Now, what did we see this week about that? Well, I thought in some ways the most powerful testimony that Kavanaugh gave was talking about what it was like to work in the White House on the day of September 11th and in the days after September 11th. And he said several times that George Bush came into the office immediately after the attack and said, this will never happen again. He said President Bush came in every morning and said, this must never happen again. He was obviously transfixed by the spectacle of the executive branch mobilizing all its resources in an attempt to defend what it saw as national security. And I think that has profoundly deepened his allegiance, and I use that word consciously, to the executive branch as the most important and powerful branch of government.
But does that take away from his belief in the judiciary and the power of the judiciary?
I have not seen overwhelming evidence that he is really a fan of judicial power. He is certainly, in the years since going to work for President Bush, he has talked a good deal about how possibly some of the precedents that hold presidents to account are wrongly decided, and that we need to provide presidents perhaps with complete immunity from criminal investigation while they're in office. That's a pretty radical position. You know, I haven't heard many people enunciate that.
Any other judges share that view?
Well, I'm sure there are, because deference to executive power is a very important part of, you know, what would be called movement conservatism, or the conservative legal movement since the 1980s. And the idea of the unitary executive, the idea that the president has complete authority over the executive branch and thus, for example, could not be prevented from firing the special counsel even by congressional legislation. That's a fairly standard executive, conservative idea. But Kavanaugh embodies it in a very strong form.
If Judge Kavanaugh had been nominated under George Bush, say, would the hearings have been this contentious? Would he have been considered such a radical nominee?
Well, I think there are three parts of that. And I think the first thing to understand is that Kavanaugh really is extraordinarily conservative, even within the spectrum of conservative judges. He is someone who's given every evidence of fairly lockstep allegiance to, you know, the agenda of the conservative legal movement, whether it's in the area of executive power, affirmative action. But, you know, Kavanaugh is a very smooth, well-trained, well-spoken, intelligent person who has not made any kind of obvious mistakes, but he's extremely conservative. But the second part of it is that would make this nomination contentious under any circumstances is what we've been talking about, this remarkable long, you know, decades-long involvement with the executive branch and this devotion of his career to the service of executive power. Kavanaugh has kept coming back during the hearings, like, I am an independent judge. The judiciary is independent. But his resume does not suggest independence. Contrast it with Anthony Kennedy, whom he's replacing, right? Kennedy had an extraordinary record. He had been a small town solo practitioner running an office in Sacramento, California on his own. beholden to no one, who, as a favor, really, worked with Governor Ronald Reagan independently from outside the administration to help him with some tax measures, and in return was named to the bench by President Ford as a gesture of friendship to President Reagan. He never was a servant of any politician. He never worked for any politician. He never was an employee of the executive branch. He was independent. And, love him or hate him, you knew that he made up his own mind. I don't see anything like that in Kavanaugh's resume.